So I think that's very interesting. Jane Austen is very, she's not as delicate and as protecting as modern feminists are today of women. Jane Austen in this entire book has all different kinds of women. All different kinds of them. They've got, if you watch the 1971 TV series, you'll probably notice one particular woman is just, she's very lovely, but eventually she gets very annoying. That's Mrs. Jennings, and in the book as well, she is just bubbly and just, you would eventually, if you weren't a family member or something, you'd think eventually you would get kind of tired of being around her, or at least you'd have to take long breaks. But there's those kinds of people in Jane Austen. And there's people like Fanny, that the kind of the money grubber Fanny. There's Edward's mother. There's very contrasting women. There are just all kinds of women in Jane Austen's book here. And so something else that Willoughby says about the letter, his wife wanted him to do this. My business was to declare myself a scoundrel, and whether I did it with a bow or a bluster was of little importance. So that's the intentions of his wife dictating the letter. And he also said, so that was on page 274. On 275, he also says that his wife had me return all the letters and even the lock of hair, my only, like, something I valued and something I treasured, I had to send that away too. And then Eleanor replies, and another part from 275, Eleanor says, you have made your own choice. It was not forced on you. And what's interesting about this little part is, Eleanor doesn't know yet that Willoughby was kind of forced to marry this other woman. And so Willoughby replies and says, do not talk to me of my wife. She does not deserve your compassion, because Willoughby was kind of being disrespectful to his wife, and Eleanor was saying, don't do that. This is your wife. You married this person. Don't be rude to her. She deserves respect from you. And then Willoughby says, oh, come on. This was like a forced marriage, and so I don't need to have respect for her. And then Willoughby asks so have I redeemed myself, at least in some small way? And Eleanor says, yes. She says, you have proved your heart less wicked, much less wicked. And then he says, and he's going to leave soon. And what's interesting is, Eleanor kind of wants him to leave now, because she's worried that if Colonel Brandon gets there, that Colonel Brandon will beat him up. And she says this Willoughby says this to Eleanor to tell Marianne. He says, tell her of my misery and my penitence. Tell her that my heart was never inconstant to her, and if you will, that at this moment she is dearer to me than ever. So that's the end, pretty much. And then there's a nice little piece here where Eleanor is thinking, and she sums up the plot of Willoughby. So she says, the world had made him extravagant and vain. Extravagance and vanity had made him cold-hearted and selfish. Vanity, while seeking its own guilty triumph at the expense of another, had involved him in a real attachment which extravagance, or at least its offspring necessity, had required to be sacrificed. Each faulty propensity in leading him to evil had led him likewise to punishment, the attachment from which against honor, against feeling, against every better interest he had outwardly torn himself, now, when no longer allowable, governed every thought, and the connection for the sake of which he had, with little scruple, left her sister to misery, was likely to prove a source of unhappiness to himself of a more incurable nature. That was on page 276. So what that little passage is meaning is Willoughby at the beginning was pursuing wealth, pursuing prestige and all that. And women to him were just playthings. And so he was sacrificing happiness he might find from women to his wealth and all that. And once Willoughby then finds a woman that he likes, it's too late because he's already sacrificed her for his other extravagances. And this has destroyed him. So I think that's the main piece from that. His primary goal has subverted him finding an even more primary goal, or even an even more beneficial or precious goal. And so he's really been misguided, and he's destroyed himself in that way, and unfortunately destroyed Marianne too. So that's kind of that part. And so Willoughby, this is near the end, this is Willoughby's like leaving. Willoughby says, I must rub through the world as well as I can. Because essentially Eleanor says, forget it, it's over, go be happy with your arranged marriage kind of thing. And Willoughby says, as to that, I must rub through the world as well as I can. Domestic happiness is out of the question. If, however, I'm allowed to think that you and yours feel an interest in my fate and actions, it may be the means, it may put me on my guard, at least it will be something to live for. So he says, I've done terrible damage, I've wrecked something that could have been precious. At least if I redeem myself a little bit in your eyes, that will make my life a little bit better. It's kind of interesting because he could have had that great life, but now that he can't, if he can convince or persuade that part of his life that he can't have anymore, that he's not a bad man, then that can add to his now crappy life. And it's interesting that how that mistake is now his only source of happiness, because it always has been. And so he's trying to extract from it what he can, because it is his only source of happiness. Because he's going to be doomed with this other woman who doesn't even like him, and so he's still that. I guess the one thing hasn't changed, that the source of happiness was Marianne, and so if Eleanor and Marianne think of him better, then that will make him happy, I guess. Okay, so now we're nearing the end. Marianne gets better, and Marianne finds out about Willoughby's visit, and she's not as crazy emotional as she used to be. There's actually a part in the book, I don't think I wrote it down, where Marianne and Eleanor come to terms a bit, and Marianne realizes that she's over this. Maybe this was this part, but I think it's earlier. Marianne realizes that she's over the top with her emotions, and so she tries to be more like Eleanor. I believe this is the part where Marianne finds out that Eleanor's been suffering all this time. This is the part where Eleanor tells Marianne about Lucy, and that Edward isn't hers, that Edward isn't Eleanor's, and that Edward has this relationship with Lucy. And so Marianne's like, how could you have not told me? You've been suffering through all this. I've been only thinking about myself and saying things to you like, how could you know what it is to suffer and all that? That's that part. And so Marianne gets better, and she now wants to, because of all this stuff that's happened, and she's had her heart broken and all that, what she would now like to do is pursuits of the mind. And through the rest of the book, she does a lot of reading, and she talks about, I think she talks about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon, and that's the author, and other books that she reads. So it's interesting that she's becoming more rational, I guess, and rather than living a life of fancy and pretty dresses and makeup and boys, now she's looking to be educated, become educated, and more contemplative, more like her sister, I guess, is how you could put that. And so now, of course, there's one storyline left, although the Marianne's, there's one little thing that happens to Marianne at the end, but there's one storyline left, of course, and that's Edward and Eleanor. What's going on with that? And so Edward visits Eleanor, and Eleanor thinks that Edward's married, and they hear about it. Actually, a servant comes in. A servant, I think he's a horseman or something, a stable person, takes care of horses. And he's from Edward's estate, I think, or his mother's estate or something like that. So he has information, right? And he tells them that age 293, the servant, I think he was a horse guy, tells the Dashwoods that Mr. Ferris is married. And they didn't know that. Here's a little piece from 294. Marianne gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Eleanor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. So, that's the reaction. Eventually, the servant guy leaves, and Eleanor is devastated this time. So, I don't know if Jane Austen is trying to make Marianne more like Eleanor, and Eleanor more like Marianne. So now Eleanor is emotional. She's crying and devastated. And what's strange is Marianne is a bit too. And there's a strange part here where their mother is there because she had still been there. Or I think they moved back. I think they're back at the estate now. And her mother doesn't know who to console. Their mother is used to consoling Marianne because Marianne is always crying, or not always, but most of the time. And at this point, they're both kind of upset, and yet Eleanor is the one who's had the biggest strike, right? And yet, still at this point, her mother doesn't know who to console. It's just a little aggravating, but anyways. Eventually, Edward visits. And I gotta find the beginning because it's really neat. Okay, here it is. Here's this good part here. 297. Scarcely had she so determined it when a figure of a man on horseback drew her eye to the window. He stopped at their gate. It was a gentleman. It was Colonel Brandon himself. Now she should hear more, and she trembled in expectations of it. So this is about hearing more about the marriage. But it was not Colonel Brandon, neither his air nor his height. Were it possible, she should say it must be Edward. She looked again. He had just dismounted. She could not be mistaken. It was Edward. She moved away and sat down. He comes from Mr. Pratt's, purposely to see us. I will be calm. I will be mistress of myself. So Eleanor is now trying to control herself. I will be calm. I will be mistress, meaning I will try to control myself. So, so Edward comes in, and Edward doesn't really know what's going on with all that. He comes in just normally, and he says, and Eleanor is there, kind of busying herself, not looking at him in the eyes, right? And so this is page 298. So Eleanor asks him, after a little bit of conversation, Eleanor asks him, "Is Mrs. Ferris at Longstaple?" "At Longstaple? No, my mother is in town." "I meant," said Eleanor, taking up some work from the table, so she's trying to keep herself a little busy here. "I meant to inquire after Mrs. Edward Ferris." You may not know that it's still somewhat used today, but certainly a lot more in the past. If you were married to if you were a woman and a wife, you're married to someone, sometimes you would not be called, let's say your name was Sarah. You would not be called Sarah Brown. You would be called Mrs. John Brown. Let's say the husband is John. You'd be called Mrs. John Brown. That would be your name. That's how you would be referred to as a wife of John Brown. So when Eleanor says, "I'm trying to inquire about Mrs. Edward Ferris," she means Edward's wife, right? And so, so after that happens, this is what I'll read from the book. "She dared not look up, but her mother and Marianne both turned their eyes on him. He colored, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation said, 'Perhaps you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferris.'" "Mrs. Robert Ferris?" was repeated by Marianne and her mother in an accent of the utmost amazement. So it turns out that, and then maybe I'll continue here. Edward then said, after some describing the emotions of the people, some of that, Edward says again, "Perhaps you do not know. You may not have heard that my brother is lately married to the youngest, to Miss Lucy Steele." So we now find out that Lucy, well, I'll give you this doesn't happen right away, but Lucy, because Edward essentially loses his inheritance from his mother and gets excommunicated and has a little bit of money but not a lot, and Lucy's poor, Lucy leaves Edward for his brother, because his brother was getting all of Edward's inheritance. His brother was getting a double inheritance because Edward wasn't getting any. So Lucy left for gold. Lucy went to his brother, Robert Ferris. And that just fell apart. So Lucy essentially kind of ripped up the promise, even though Edward was honorable and was going to go through with that promise that he made to Lucy. Lucy said, "Well, I don't really want to do that anymore, so you're off the hook now, and I will marry your brother instead, who's got money." So it's funny because Edward comes to the house, and of course the rest of them think that he's married now, and Eleanor is devastated. So now to find out that Edward isn't married, as soon as Edward leaves, Edward gets embarrassed and leaves. And after that, Eleanor runs upstairs, all on a fluster again, acting like Marianne, and because she's so happy that Edward now isn't married. But what's even more hilarious about the whole situation is the reason why Edward was going there in the first place was to propose to Eleanor and to get that done. So he comes back like in an hour. He comes back after a bit, so the embarrassment's kind of gone, and then he gets it done. He gets it over with. And geez, so that storyline is finally completed. And that's finished. And then later on they find out that Lucy kind of went for gold. And there's a letter written. Lucy writes a letter to Edward breaking off the relationship. It's in here. It's on page 303, but I don't think it's worth reading on camera, but it exists. And essentially it says, I've left you for your brother. I don't think it says it because he has money, but oh, I know why. It says in the letter that Lucy says that for the longest time your heart has been elsewhere, and so I've taken my heart elsewhere. One gets the sense that Lucy may have known that Eleanor has liked Edward this whole time, and so one may say that Lucy is a good character because Lucy recognizes it and chooses to break that off and to let Eleanor and Edward get together. But at the same time, I don't know if it's in the book. I have read a bit of a review on the book just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And the book says that, the review said that Lucy left him for money. So I don't know. That's maybe up for debate. So that is it for that last storyline. But then, of course, there's one little piece left for Marianne, which isn't very interesting. It's kind of dumb. And according to the review I read, they actually say it might have been a mistake of Jane Austen's to do this as an ending. Jane Austen was getting, I can't remember now if she was getting tired of writing it or she had left it for a while and then came back to it. But anyways, let me just say it. Eventually, Marianne gets with Colonel Brandon, and it seems really ridiculous. But if you remember at the beginning of the book, Marianne does say that I don't know if actually maybe I didn't mention it on camera here. Marianne near the beginning of the book says that Colonel Brandon's too old and that she wouldn't think about him at all. But anyways, near the end of the book, they get together, and Colonel Brandon, Marianne makes all these excuses for him. Like it's almost like a poorly tied up ending, I think, to the book. It's kind of crappy. But anyways, and the last little bit is that Eleanor and Colonel Brandon has money, by the way, a bit of money. Colonel Brandon and Marianne marry, and they ask Eleanor and Edward to stay at their estate. They give them a home and all that. So that's kind of the happy ending. So that's it for the review. I think there's quite a bit here to consider. I think I've given enough points, and I've certainly given you the whole storyline, but also enough points of interest for you to think about, and also if you have to, I know some people read this book for high school or something. Certainly stuff to think about and write about if you have to write on it. You certainly can look up stuff on websites, look for themes and all that. I know I was looking at a website that had all kinds of themes, like how love is discussed in the book, how wealth is discussed, family, women, and femininity. Like I said probably 15 minutes ago, Jane Austen is not a modern feminist like today. Jane Austen portrays women in every stripe in this book. Every stripe. From the bubbly and very, very charismatic to the point of annoyance Mrs. Jennings, to the very cold and ice witchery of Edward's mother, to and his sister Fanny. Fanny is very. If you watch the 1971 TV series, Fanny is very well played. Fanny is very passive aggressive and just a nasty, like just polite nastiness, that kind of stuff. Fanny is that. And John is kind of dumb. He just kind of goes along with all of it. Anyways, that's a review for Jane Austen. I plan to do more. That was a nice fiction novel, but I also have in the planning stages a book called How to Read a Book by Adler, Mortimer J. Adler, and Doran, I think, and also Icarus Fallen. Both those are nonfiction. Icarus Fallen by Del Sol, pretty good book, worth putting on the internet for people to learn something from. So I hope this has been useful. Please let me know if you have any comments. Anything you want to add to what you got out of the book is great. And if you're watching this video, have a look for the comments below. And there might be one down there that that corrects a mistake of the book that I did or that I said, or add something to it that you can learn from. So that would be great. I hope you enjoyed it.